Since 2010, Western media has become increasingly alarmist about Russia's actions in Africa.
A large social network that promotes anti-Western and pro-Kremlin ideas.
They have made the most rapid propaganda successes, I would say, in the history of propaganda.
Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin relies on plundering natural resources.
He told me then that Russia is back in Africa.
Or perhaps you prefer the alternative.
And I will even supply the weapons to Russia, because Russia is in a war with imperialism.
Russia did not have a strong tradition of colonialism or imperialism.
Nous aimons les Russes et nous aimons la culture russe en son temps.
This is neither of these stories. This documentary is like standing on top of a mountain. This is the long view. Most people don't know Russia and Africa have a relationship going back over 1,000 years. It's a relationship involving failed colonization missions, plans to fund rebellions, military coups, and civil wars. It's also been a relationship of cultural exchange. African states have been seen as a source of knowledge, and Africans have risen to the highest levels of society in Russia. Africa has shaped the sprawling Eurasian Empire, just as Russia has shaped Africa. When we look at Russia-African relationships from a historical perspective, the novelty of the Africa Corps and propaganda campaigns begins to wear off. Surprise that Russia would be involved in the continent is revealed to be naive. Sometime liberator, other times colonizer, always an alternative to Western dominance. From Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, this is the story of 1,000 years of Russia in Africa. As Viking settlers began to explore and finally control the lands between the Baltic and the Black Sea, the first Russian state was formed. The capital of Rus was the city of Kiev, and as their power grew, the Varangian kings began to build diplomatic links abroad. Vladimir the Great reportedly sent 1,001 emissaries to the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, a sign of wealth and power, but also international aspirations. Ultimately, the Fatimid connection failed, as Vladimir chose to convert from paganism to Christianity, rejecting Muslim and Jewish missionaries and changing the history of Russia forever. Vladimir and his predecessors ensured that the Eastern Orthodox tradition of Christianity became the dominant religion in Russia and its neighboring states. This meant Russian Christians shared more traditions with Orthodox churches in Egypt than Catholic churches in Rome. Kievan Rus ended during the Mongol invasion, and Russian power moved further north. But ties between the new Russian state in Moscow and Orthodox churches in Alexandria flourished in the 1500s. Russian diplomats visited Egypt, whilst local Christian leaders, called patriarchs, received cash grants from Ivan the Great. Russia's connection to the church in Egypt also linked them indirectly to Ethiopia. Christianity had spread south from Egypt to Ethiopia in the 300s. In the 1500s, Patriarch Pigas negotiated with Coptic and Ethiopian religious leaders, whilst also maintaining close ties with Russia. These tentative early connections would flourish over the coming centuries as Russian interest in Egypt and Ethiopia grew. In 1666, Patriarch Paisius arrived from Egypt and Moscow, where he helped the state to crush a reformist movement within the Russian Orthodox Church. When Paisius faced problems on his return to Alexandria after a long absence, the Russian state stepped in to help. By this time, Egypt was a province within the Ottoman Empire, and Sultan Mehmed IV had authority on all religious matters. Russian diplomats petitioned the Ottoman Sultan to reinstate Paisius, who had been deposed by rivals. Eventually Mehmed agreed, marking Russia's first successful intervention in political affairs on the African continent. By the 1600s, the Russian language was being spoken and translated in the palaces of the Mamluks in Cairo. But some people had much bigger plans for Russia in Africa. As the Ottoman Empire expanded into Europe in the 1670s and 80s, Christian European states looked for allies. One tentative plan was to encourage an alliance between Russia and Ethiopia, attacking the Ottomans from two sides at once. Working for the German Duchy of Saxe-Gotha, Hiob Ludolf tried to drum up support for the scheme in Moscow. Ludolf was a scholar of Ethiopian languages, which he had learned from visiting monks. Sadly, Russia had little interest in looking south. The imperial state was rapidly expanding eastwards into the Eurasian steppes. In 1718, the Russia-Ethiopia Connection was floated again, this time by the Patriarch in Alexandria, who pushed for Russia to send an expedition to Ethiopia to establish diplomatic ties and gather information. Again, the plan came to nothing. Under Russia's modernizing Tsar, Peter the Great, more exotic climes beckoned. Peter was fascinated by India and desperately wanted to connect his empire to the subcontinent. His attempts to do so through Central Asia ground to a halt. Then he heard Russia's rivals, Sweden and France, had plans to establish colonies in Madagascar. Peter dispatched the new Russian fleet to investigate, either to find a king to establish diplomatic ties, or in the absence of any political authority, conquer the island and set up a king supported by Russia. In Peter's mind, Madagascar could serve as a strategic port on the route to India. Unfortunately, the whole plan fell apart when ships in the new fleet sprung leaks and the navy returned to port in Russia. In this period, Russia's engagement with Africa was often mediated through the Ottoman Empire. Russians most often met Africans in their wars or negotiations with Ottomans. One famous example of this was the black African Gannibal, who was kidnapped and enslaved by Ottoman soldiers as a child. Gannibal was a servant at the court of the Ottoman Sultan when he caught the eye of the Russian ambassador. At the time, it was popular to have token black servants at European courts, and Peter the Great was looking for a few clever little Africans. Gannibal was ransomed from the Sultan and sent to Russia, where he was baptized and adopted by the Tsar. Abran Gannibal was the most famous of Peter's court Africans, going on to become an engineer in the army. Gannibal married into the nobility, and his descendants included the great Russian poet Pushkin. Although Gannibal was claimed by the Ethiopian government in the 20th century, recent research now suggests he came from modern Cameroon and was the son of a local chief. Russia finally lifted the Ottoman curtain over Africa in the 1770s during the First Russo-Turkish War. It was symbolic the Russian frigate Africa was one of the ships which destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Chesma. Now Russia could use its fleet to project power along the North African coast. By the 1780s, Russia began funding its first insurgency in Africa. The Mamluk Beys of Egypt were growing in power and looking to throw off the shackles of the Ottoman Empire. Russia decided to support them. Russian military officers visited Egypt and were received with honor. Hundreds of Russian peasant sons were sent to serve in the Mamluk army. An Egyptian ambassador was based permanently in Moscow. The Russian state was happy to use Egypt as a thorn in the side of their Ottoman enemies. The French invasion of Egypt under Napoleon in 1798 threw Russia's Egypt alliance into disarray. But after order was restored in 1801 and the French left, Britain and Russia signed a joint agreement of communal protection over Egypt. At the start of the 19th century, Russia was a dominating power in North Africa. The doorway to Inner Africa lay open. What might have been the start of a Russian territorial empire in Africa was arrested by a sudden change in foreign policy. In 1825, Tsar Nicholas came to the throne, and the rebellious Egyptians went from friends to enemies. Russia now looked to support the Ottoman Empire, worried other European powers might seize territory on Russia's borders. Egypt's modernizing leader, Muhammad Ali, transformed the army and seized Syria from the Ottomans. He then began marching his forces towards the Ottoman capital, Constantinople. Worried what this would mean for Russian influence in the region, Tsar Nicholas blocked Muhammad Ali's path with his army, and the Egyptians withdrew. The fragile Russia-Ottoman alliance fell apart in 1853 as Britain's attempt to act as a mediator over religious protection issues backfired. The Crimea War saw Britain ally with the Ottomans against Russia. Today, thousands of Africans fight in the war in Ukraine, some as mercenaries, others as criminal soldiers for Wagner. But they are not the first Africans to fight over Russian interests in the region. 150 years ago, tens of thousands of Berber soldiers poured into Crimea from Tunisia. Fighting under the Ottoman flag, many of the survivors later settled in Turkey. Conflict with Egyptians and Ottomans brought the old idea of a Russia-Ethiopian alliance back to the table. Again, the Russian state seemed disinterested despite the enthusiasm of church officials like Porphyrius. Porphyrius believed it was Ethiopia's destiny to lead Africa to God, and it was Russia's duty to support and encourage the Christian state. In fact, it was the Ethiopian king, Johannes IV, who made the first move, sending the Tsar an ancient gold cross as a token of their shared religion in the 1870s. Johannes was hard-pressed by Egypt and Sudan and would have welcomed Russian support in his wars. Tsar Alexander II did not respond immediately, but in 1884 an expedition was sent to establish diplomatic ties with Ethiopia. Its leader was an adventurer and monk known as Nikolai Ashinov. The Russians were received with public honor, and Ashinov went home an inspired man. Like Peter the Great's plan to have a naval port in Madagascar, Ashinov suggested Russia should establish a port on the Somali coast. The Russian government was wary. They didn't want to start a war with France and felt the move would be seen as an aggression against French interests in the region. In the end, Ashinov found his supporters within and outside the government. Without formal approval, Ashinov was still described as a Russian Columbus by church officials, and the Ministry of the Navy supplied tools and equipment. Ashinov believed this was a turning point in Russia's history. He believed the imperial state would shift its focus from the Balkans to Africa as the colony grew. In 1889, Ashinov and his colonists arrived in modern-day Djibouti, where they were greeted by a delegation of Ethiopian Orthodox priests. They made the town of Sagallo their base and set up a tent to act as a church, naming the site New Moscow. Several weeks later, French gunboats arrived, and after miscommunication between the parties, they opened fire, killing several of the Russians. The survivors were arrested and returned to Russia. Tsar Alexander II immediately washed his hands of the affair, accusing Ashinov of disobedience and avoiding conflict with France. Russia's late colonial African adventure was a complete failure. The formal colony idea failed, but ties with Ethiopia grew even stronger in the 1890s. An Ethiopian alliance was seen as a way to threaten British possessions in the Sudan and Egypt. Russians travelled to Ethiopia to build hospitals and schools. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1895, a Russian Red Cross team was sent to help wounded Ethiopian soldiers. The war with the Italians saw the mobilization of the entire Ethiopian army. Boys and men left their homes and marched to join Emperor Menelik's forces. One such boy was Tekle Hawariat, who, aged 11, left home with his brother to fight in the army. During the war, his brother died, and the young Hawariat, who was now without a brother and father, came to the attention of the Ethiopian royal Ras Makonnen. Makonnen entrusted the boy to a member of the Russian Red Cross team who adopted him and took him back to Russia. Count Nikolai Leontiev encouraged Hawariat into the Russian army, where he rose to the rank of colonel before eventually returning to Ethiopia. Hawariat served as a provincial administrator, and eventually helped draft Ethiopia's first constitution. He was also a famous playwright. The Russia Connection was viewed very positively in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian bishop Abune Petros frequently preached sermons calling for the establishment of a Russian protectorate in Ethiopia, similar to the one established by France for Christians in the Levant. When the communist revolution started in Russia, many Russian aristocrats fled to Ethiopia, seeing it as a safe haven because of their shared imperial cultures. The last flourishing of the connection between Imperial Russia and Ethiopia would come long after the establishment of communism in Russia. In 1923, the brother-in-law of the late Tsar visited Ethiopia to hand over documents compiled by the former Russian government in support of Ethiopian claims to certain holy places in Jerusalem. Alexander Mikhailovich was honored as an imperial guest by Haile Selassie, who wanted to discuss in detail the fall of Russia's imperial monarchy. The more he talked about the mistakes committed by my relatives, Mikhailovich remembered, the clearer it dawned on me that we should have put an Ethiopian at the head of our imperial council. Selassie liked to hear my stories of the reign of my relatives because they helped him decide what he should not do. One other area that attracted the interests of the late imperial government in Russia was South Africa. Britain's war against the Boers was very unpopular in Russia, and the government sent an officer to observe the war at the Boer headquarters. Some Russians, like Alexander Guchov, volunteered to fight against the British. Guchov was later wounded and captured before he was allowed to return to Russia when the war ended. The strength of anti-British feeling led the Russian state to consider its most ambitious plan in Africa. In 1905, a Boer general, Joubert Pinard, contacted the Russian embassy to inform them he was looking for support to lead an uprising against the British. The plan was to encourage both black South Africans and Boers to rise up against the British imperialists. Russia would provide the weapons, and after the rebellion, the new nation would fall into Russia's sphere of influence. The plan was discussed between government departments, but ultimately it was rejected. The treasury was still suffering after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. But it's interesting to note that before Russia had even adopted communism, the state was considering funding anti-colonial rebellions against European powers in Africa. The 19th century was the moment Russia might have launched its territorial empire in Africa. But distracted by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and its concerns in Asia, Russia chose a path of peace on the continent, giving in to rival European powers during confrontation. After hundreds of years of discussion, this was also the century the Russian state finally established a close relationship with Ethiopia, although this owed as much to the initiatives of the Ethiopian government as the Russian one. But in 1917, everything would change, and Russia's relationship with Africa would never be the same again. After 2 revolutions and a civil war, Russia's imperial family was murdered, and famine swept through the country. The Bolshevik revolutionaries were initially led by Vladimir Lenin, who was inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx. Marx believed the terrible and unjust conditions endured by workers in industrialized societies would lead them to rise up against the factory owners and establish a new form of government and economic organization, communism. Lenin adapted these ideas and applied them to European empires. For Lenin, the decadent inequalities of imperialism were the highest stage of late capitalism. Imperialism was caused by capitalist greed, and as early as 1919, the organization which promoted world communism, the Comintern, declared its solidarity with the colonial slaves of Africa and Asia. But when Lenin died, and Joseph Stalin assumed control of the USSR, this internationalist outlook faded. Stalin argued the USSR should strengthen socialism within the country first, before trying to export it. In any case, continents like Africa lacked sufficient industrialization to launch authentic revolutions. One exception to this rule was Ethiopia. Although Ethiopia was a constitutional monarchy, it was a potential thorn in the side of European colonial powers. Just as Hiob Ludolf had fantasized about attacking the Ottomans from the rear with Ethiopia 400 years ago, now Stalin saw Ethiopia as a way to attack European capitalist imperialism from the rear. This dream came to nothing, as fascist Italy invaded and occupied Ethiopia in 1936. In the build-up to World War II, Italy became the dominant force in North Africa, a state of affairs which would only change after their defeat in 1945. In the post-war world, Ethiopia began moving towards the Western powers, and Russia's influence in Africa looked to have reached an all-time low. Stalin died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev emerged victorious from the ensuing power struggle. Khrushchev began to relax some of Stalin's oppressive policies in the USSR, but he also looked abroad to build positive relationships beyond Europe. In the 1780s, Russia had sent military support to Egypt to strengthen its position against its Ottoman rivals. Now, almost 300 years later, Khrushchev turned to Egypt again as a potential friend and thorn in the side of Western rivals. In 1955, a major arms deal was agreed, and Egyptian officers were sent for training in Eastern Europe. This support came not a moment too soon, as the Suez Crisis of 1956 saw Britain and France and Israel invade Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. As the Egyptian forces tried to hold out against the invaders using their Soviet-manufactured planes and tanks, the USSR and USA put pressure on Britain and France to withdraw. The Soviet government threatened to intervene on the Egyptian side and to launch rocket attacks on Britain, France, and Israel. Eventually, the invading forces were forced into a humiliating withdrawal, signifying the end of European global dominance. Power was now bipolar, with the USA and USSR facing off against each other. It was in Africa that the new Cold War world crystallized. The Soviet Union's re-engagement with Africa was not solely based on conflict. Khrushchev was especially excited by the Africans he met at the Moscow World Youth Conference in 1957. 3 years later, he established the People's Friendship University in the city, designed to provide higher education to students from developing countries. The institution was named after Congo's new leader, Patrice Lumumba. Khrushchev was still interested in having a port on the Indian Ocean. He wanted to frustrate the USA and its allies in Africa. He wanted to promote support for the Soviets at the United Nations, and even gain access to some of Africa's resources through trade and infrastructure projects. These aims would have been familiar to his Russian imperial predecessors, but unlike them, Khrushchev was also a missionary, looking to export his faith in communism to Africa and encourage African states to take the correct, anti-capitalist path to development. For the first time in its history, the USSR looked to build relations with states in West and Central Africa. One early site of American and Soviet competition was the French colony of Guinea. Ahmed Sékou Touré initially sided with the USSR, adopting nationalization policies and relying on large Soviet infrastructure projects. But to Khrushchev's surprise, African leaders did not necessarily feel obliged to reject support from the USA as well. Through a campaign of careful personal diplomacy, President Kennedy was able to disrupt Guinea's alignment with the communist bloc. For some African leaders, the demands made by Soviet attachés were condescending and impractical. Using orthodox Marxist-Leninist economic theory to guide development often failed. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana adapted these ideas to create something they called African socialism, projecting key Marxist concepts like the need to ban religion and the inevitability of class struggle, a stance that scandalized Soviet academics in Moscow. These early frustrations in Soviet foreign policy came to a head in the Congo crisis. In the early 1960s, the Cold War turned hot in Africa for the first time. The Soviet government initially worked to establish economic relations with the newly independent Congo. Moscow's newest university was named after Patrice Lumumba. But as Western powers quickly intervened in the fragile state, Khrushchev had to shift his strategy and decide whether to commit ground forces to the conflict. And despite his threats, the USSR didn't have the capacity or means to launch a rapid military intervention to save Lumumba and his supporters. By 1965, the ascendancy of American interests in the region was complete, and the pro-US dictator Mobutu was in power. Faced with unorthodox socialism in Ghana, two-faced leaders in Guinea, and lost to America in the Congo crisis, the USSR shifted its approach in Africa and became more pragmatic. Now the Soviet government looked for ideologically reliable leaders who needed military assistance. In 1965, African soldiers again began traveling to the Crimea, not to fight against Russia as they did in the 1850s, but instead to be trained to fight in their own independence struggles. Center 165 hosted freedom fighters from Angola, Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Mozambique. The famous anti-colonial leaders like Oliver Tambo, José Marquez, and Amilcar Cabral received intensive courses from the KGB that included Russian language, historical study of revolutions, and training in guerrilla warfare. Center 165 was the heart of Soviet policy in the 1970s, as the USSR supported graduates from its training course with funding and weapons in their freedom struggles. Over the next 20 years, the Soviet government indirectly supported conflicts across Africa. In Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, Somalia, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe, and South Africa and Namibia, to name a few. By the 1980s, roughly 40% of arms supplied in Africa came from the Soviet Union. Over 70% of tanks used by African armies were Soviet manufactured. But the strategy of supporting independence movements, which would in turn owe their loyalty to the USSR, didn't always go perfectly to plan. Soviet theorists and academics tried to reduce these conflicts to the building blocks of communist theory. Religious and economic divisions were ignored in conflict analysis. They argued when Africans talked about race, they were actually addressing an economic issue, class. A key idea was that African states would implant socialism through a revolutionary party, known as the Vanguard. This avoided the need to ensure capitalist industrialization on the path to communism. Rather, these revolutionary anti-imperial states would take total control of politics and the economy and guide the nation towards socialism. However, as the Angolan and Mozambican civil wars dragged on, this certainty in the Vanguard Party model began to waver. Resistance to socialist regimes couldn't just be explained away by American funding. In fact, it was leaders like Nkrumah in Ghana and Nyerere in Tanzania who adapted socialist ideas to address local needs, who found more success. Ideologically inflexible liberation movements tended to struggle in the post-independence world. For the Soviet government, the exciting gains of the 1970s gave way to another reality check in the 80s. Even committed African communists could not be fully trusted, as they had a tendency to accept Chinese funding. Center 165 was transformed into an ordinary military base. Africans had used Soviet training and arms to fight against colonial powers and each other. In some cases, this appeared to have contributed to stable liberated states. In others, Soviet and American funds had perpetuated lengthy civil wars. War was not the only way the USSR was involved in Africa. The Soviet Union left behind many large-scale infrastructure projects. The Aswan High Dam in Egypt, the Kapanda hydroelectric power plant in Angola, the Kalana gold mine in Mali, the Assab oil refinery in Nigeria. In other ways, its legacy was also symbolic. A Soviet-manufactured rifle remains on the Mozambican flag today. But in the late 1980s, the USSR's interest in Africa was diminishing as it began to face serious problems in Europe. The collapse of communist Russia in 1991 would signal the end of the Cold War, and many African states began to gently move towards Western alignment. Perhaps the strangest impact of the decline in Soviet power was on the situation in South Africa. In the 1970s and 80s, America had supported the apartheid government in its wars against Soviet-funded communists in Namibia and Angola. But as the situation in Southern Africa cooled, it became increasingly difficult for America to justify support for a racist regime. The Western powers moved from allies to opponents, and Western economic and political pressure came to bear on the apartheid government. Nelson Mandela's release from prison was celebrated across America and Europe, and the story of the ANC's long-term Soviet funding was quietly forgotten. What might have been a Soviet story of triumphant liberation instead became a Western one. As socialism in Russia collapsed, so too did the ties of socialist solidarity that had once seemed to join the USSR to its African allies. Like under Stalin in the 1920s, Russia disengaged from Africa again to focus on itself. President Boris Yeltsin would go on to blame Russia's economic problems on the excessive aid given by the Soviet Union to nations in Africa. Under Vladimir Putin, Russian troops returned to Africa in force as part of UN peacekeeping missions in DRC, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Western Sahara. But it wasn't until the 2010s that Russia began to focus again on rebuilding diplomatic ties across the continent, the equivalent of asking African leaders, "Do you want to be my friend again?" Once again, Russia is offering an alternative for African states tired of the demands made by Western donors. Putin's Russia is especially interested in minerals, importing 100% of manganese, 80% of chrome, and 60% of bauxite requirements. To make itself more attractive as a trading partner, Russia has offered debt relief and cheap grain and arms sales. No longer shackled by Soviet ideology, Putin offers a pragmatic alternative to African leaders beset by Western donors, whose assistance is conditional to human rights records and fair elections. But that's not to say ideology hasn't played a role in Russia's re-engagement with the continent. Putin is keen to present himself as a bulwark of traditional values. The Russian Orthodox Church, which maintains a close relationship with the state, has been rapidly expanding in Africa, offering financial incentives to independent Orthodox churches and those previously linked to the Patriarchate in Egypt. At the 2023 Russia-Africa Summit, Patriarch Kirill told the assembled African leaders his church shared African traditional values on issues of sex, gender, and euthanasia. Backed by the church on one side, Putin has used the private military company, the Wagner Group, on the other. Wagner has been present in Africa from at least 2017, being deployed in Sudan, Libya, Central African Republic, Mozambique, Mali, and most recently in Burkina Faso. Wagner has offered support to African governments favourable to Russia, as well as helping to secure control over profitable mining rights and trade. Since the death of its leader, Wagner has rebranded itself as Africa Corps and is now semi-officially connected to the Russian state. Trade and traditional values, boots on the ground, but there is one more area where Russia has made headlines in Africa: disinformation. To Western media outlets, this is a dirty word, but the way this operates in practice can make it attractive to African governments. One example of this is the recent outbreak of dengue fever in Burkina Faso. Reporting on the outbreak was carried out by informal social media users backed by Russia, Russia's formal media network, the Africa Initiative, and the Burkina Faso state government. In this situation, all three sources worked in tandem and backed each other up to present a narrative blaming the World Bank and IMF for the dengue fever in the country, arguing their debt repayment demands had crippled the Burkina Faso health services. Fortunately, Russia's medical teams were able to fly in and support the process. Disinformation like this can become a narrative spin, which benefits multiple parties, presenting Russia in a positive light and shielding the Burkina Faso government from blame. In the Western imagination, disinformation is connected to the false idea that if only Africans had the right information, they would align with the Western powers and reject Russia. But in many African nations, the Western powers have their own mixed history, and Russia is seen to be offering an empowering alternative to 30 years of American dominance. Although Russia's growth in Africa over the past decade has been swift, it has simply been returning to a position it held during the Cold War. With the growing Chinese presence, enduring American influence, and the emergence of groups like BRICS, it's doubtful Russia will become the single dominant power in Africa anytime soon. But Russia is not a trespasser in Africa. Or at least, it is no more a trespasser than America, Britain, France, or Turkey. For many Africans, Russia's heritage on the continent has been that of offering an alternative. First, an alternative to Ottoman power, then an alternative to European power, and finally, an alternative to America. Perhaps part of the problem with coverage of recent Russian actions in Africa has been the focus on Russia. In reality, every relationship goes two ways, and throughout history, Africans have affected Russian policy and culture, just as Russia has affected theirs. So when news reaches us that Burkina Faso has moved away from America and France towards a pro-Russian stance, we need to analyze the choices being made by African leaders. Are these good decisions which will benefit the people? History shows working with Russia can go both ways. This is our first long-form documentary, so what did you think? Why not tell us below? And if you enjoyed this, why not subscribe to the Africa Review on YouTube?